Okay, well, thank you for inviting me to come and speak. I'm here representing UK and Changing Europe. Many of you will know this nationwide think tank, which is made up of a series of projects funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. I'm a member of one of the projects, which the title is The Economic Impacts of Brexit on the UK, its regions, its cities and its sectors. There's a whole group of us here. It's basically, it's led by the City Ready Institute at the University of Birmingham. Project leader is Professor Raquel Ortega-Larquile. So you can click into the website. If you Google that, on your smartphones, you'll go straight into the website. You'll see all the papers, all the data, all the reports, all the videos and discussions. So our activities are all part of UK and Changing Europe. We have University of Birmingham City Ready Institute leads the project. I'm at the University of Sheffield. We also have a team from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and the Dutch PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. You may think, well, why are all these Dutch people involved in this? Because the Dutch have the data. The World Input Output databases, which are the largest trade growth data sets in the world, along with what are called the Madison data sets, which is the foundation of the OECD data, and what's called the Penn World Tables. They are all housed in the University of Groningen, and the data, which is coordinated internationally with multiple universities and institutes all over the world, the guys who manage those data sets are in our team. That's the background to this. When the Brexit event took place, as a team and as a group, we've all been working together on many other projects. So we're all friends and colleagues as well. We realised that we had the data to do things that many other people couldn't. And so we decided to put in a bid, and we won one of them. And we feel pretty confident that what we've been doing has been getting a lot of traction. It's been widely covered in the international press, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Financial Times, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, The Guardian, New Statesman, BBC, Channel 4. We've had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of views and downloads of our work. So this is basically the background to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and run through this very quickly. So that's the project. It's a UK and a Changing Europe project, and Professor Aidan at King's College London, many of you will be familiar with. He's the coordinator of the whole network. There's 25 projects with many experts and fellows who are funded to work. And the idea is to produce independent evidence on a whole series of things. And we are one of the economics teams. And our job is looking at the relationship between international trade issues and what happens inside a country in terms of sectors, regions, cities, and so on. That's the focus of our work. And everything I'm showing you today has all been published already. We've got more work ongoing that we're going to be publishing some more things in the next month or two. But basically, everything that's here is open access. So you can download. If you go to the website, you'll see everything. Okay, how does this start? We were the team who demonstrated this. We had a short paper that was published a week before the referendum, and then since then we enhanced it and did a great deal more work. It's this. On the bottom axis, if you like the x-axis, is the proportion of people in a locality. These are NUTS 2 areas. The proportion of the people in the locality that voted Leave, and this is their direct dependence on European markets for local economic prosperity. So these are places in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, the Midlands, Nottinghamshire, Staffordshire, Shropshire, Leicestershire, heavily Leave voting regions are more dependent on European markets directly for their prosperity than Remain voting regions. Why is that important? Because the metropolitan elite argument. The idea that the real beneficiaries of Europe are the rich networks of elites in London and everyone else is left out. It's not true, it's completely opposite. This is London. London is less dependent on European markets than anywhere else in Europe. Why? Because it's the most hyper-globalized city in the world. These are the places, like for example East Yorkshire. If you're a trader in Hull, what do? Are you selling things routinely to Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia, Belize, Namibia? No. You're sticking stuff on ferries, and it's going to Germany, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium. What do you see? These are the places, in terms of their GDP, gross domestic product, at a regional level, directly dependent on household, consumer, and business investment demand in the rest of the EU. Okay, second part. That's in terms of local labour incomes. The dispersion is different because the capital labour structures of different regions are different. But this is based on what's called the interregional extensions of the World Input Output database, and our team lead the building of these extensions. 14 million data points for each year. So imagine the computational effort to put these together. But basically, the places that voted leave, what's in people's pay packets is directly related to the leave vote, which is dependent on European markets. And you may say, well, are these big numbers? 12%, 14%, and so you have to remember that the contractions associated with the global financial crisis were typically 2 to 3%. Now, it's not saying that this is directly what's going to happen as a result of Brexit. It's the level of exposure of those localities. It's how much they're dependent on those places. So think of it in terms of, if things don't go well, how much are they not going to go well in your locality relative to other places? And again, this is London down here. It doesn't really matter what happens in the case of London. It's relatively tiny effect in comparison to the leave voting places. So of course you've got an expectations problem, because people primarily voted thinking they were going to hopefully improve the conditions and the viability and prosperity of their communities. Whereas the data says the complete opposite. Indeed, most of the places that voted leave have become more dependent on European markets since the millennium. The UK aggregate dependency on Europe has actually fallen, but it's almost entirely a London effect, which pulls the national average down, because London is 23% of the UK economy. If you think about the wider commuting patterns, the wider size of the kind of functional area of London, then it's close to 12 million people according to the OECD data, then you're looking at a third of the UK economy. So the London effect pulls everything down. You often hear that the UK is not as dependent on Europe as it used to be. It's only one part of the UK where that's true. Well, a little bit parts of Scotland as well. But the leave voting areas in the Midlands, the north of England, Northern Ireland, Wales have actually become more dependent on European markets in the last 15, 20 years, which is no surprise because of market integration. Nor is it an issue about sectors. Often you hear narratives in the press around financial services, often services versus manufacturing. We often hear these discussions. What people in the press have in their mind is financial services in London. Financial services in London are largely disconnected in terms of these shock effects, potentially, because their dependence is very, very small. It's not really about that. It's not manufacturing or services. When I've tried to explain this before, think about the example of being in Birmingham, for example, Coventry. If you're a small engineering company, work with automotive technologies, and you get a contract with Toyota or Jaguar Land Rover, what do you do? If you're a family business, 3, 4, 5 generations of engineers, do you go to the financial markets in London to get credit? No, of course you don't. You go to local businesses which work specifically with the technology related to the auto sector. They know their financing, their capital requirements, their discount rates, the leverage rates. They have expertise in those engineering sectors. They do it locally. Do they go to one of the big 4, big 5 legal companies in London to get legal advice? No. They go to local companies that have specific knowledge of how those engineering sectors work, and so on. So the point is that the more dependent you are on European markets, according to manufacturing, the more dependent you also are in services. And it works the other way around. The more dependent you are in services, the more dependent you are in manufacturing. And these places with high levels of dependency of both are primarily places that voted leave. It's because of the nature of what we call global value chains. In the press, kind of a shorthand is the notion of a supply chain. So you tend to think of an automotive firm with lots of suppliers. What we don't think about is all the legal and financial services and intellectual property services and computing services and technical and testing services, which are all service industries connected with those manufacturing activities. And we also don't think about the fact that things go forwards and backwards all the time across borders. And that's an important issue I'll come to in a second. This, someone said earlier, what is the opportunities outside of the EU? Someone mentioned that. Well, these in terms of the World Input Output Database, we can calculate these effects. How big are these opportunities in other places? Well, this is the relative size of the European Union's contribution to the UK economy. It's about 10% of GDP. Is that a small number or a big number? It's about half the contribution of the London economy. 2/3 of the contribution of the economy of the southeast of England, which is the second largest region, and it's actually a larger contribution to the UK economy than any other region of the UK. Bigger than the Northwest, bigger than Yorkshire and Humberside, bigger than Scotland. Actually, they're very big numbers. We look at China. Many people are excited about opportunities in the developing, emerging markets in Asia, for example. How big is the Chinese economy in terms of the UK? The Chinese economy is similar-ish size to the US, a bit smaller, but it's growing quickly. But how big is it in the UK? It's about the size of the economy of Newcastle. would really people get very excited about that? What about the economy of Canada or Australia? There's possible trade deals. About the size of the economy of Bournemouth. Free trade deals with New Zealand, you're talking about somewhere like the size of the economy of Chesterfield. Even if New Zealand's growing really fast, that's like a new housing estate in Chesterfield. At the macro level, it's basically irrelevant. These are symbolic issues. In terms of trade issues, they're just not really important at all. What you have to do is think differently. The reason is because goods and services are going forward and backwards across borders all the time. It's not just car components going forwards and backwards. Services, financing, R&D, again, financing and refinancing, insurance, legal services, forwards and backwards all the time in all kind of industries. The point about that is what you can't do is start talking about trade surpluses or trade deficits. This is a narrative we see in the press all the time. So the UK has a trade deficit, for example, with the rest of the EU. So the argument says then the rest of the EU will be desperate to do a good trade deal with the UK because they have a trade deficit, a trade surplus, and you don't want to lose it. Well, think about the logic, because it implies then, okay, what does that mean for the UK? Well, the UK has a trade deficit, so do we want a deal or not? The point is the extent to which the trade surplus partner wants a deal is mirrored inversely by the extent to which the other partner doesn't want a trade deal. And you need everyone to agree to have a trade deal. So if you've got trade surplus versus trade deficit argument, there's never going to be a deal because one person always doesn't want it. Unless trade deals always help the apparently weaker partner, which of course is nonsense. Everything we know about trade deals is the other way around. Why is it? Because the logic is called mercantilism. It's nonsense. It disappeared with the Corn Law debates in the 19th century. There's not a single economics course anywhere in the world that teaches mercantilism. You teach it in economic history as a way of understanding how people thought about trade-related issues. But today, it's been superseded by comparative advantage, Ricardian thinking, modern trade thinking. It doesn't mean anything. What you have to do is calculate what's called value added in exports. And value added in exports is calculating the real value added related to trade, so the real value added domestically, allowing for the fact that goods and services go across borders multiple times. Because a lot of trade statistics are simply adding up things going forwards and backwards. Yeah? And the more fragmented is the production, the higher is the gross value of exports and gross value of imports. You've got to deflate for the fact that things are going forwards and backwards all the time. It's a complicated problem. The way you do it is to calculate what's called gross value added in exports. And the way to do that is imagine a Brexit scenario. This is not about Brexit, this is just what you have to do these things. It's very complicated technically, but think about it in principle. What you have to do is you compare today's relationships between the UK with all these EU countries and the rest of the world. What you do is you compare that with, imagine on Brexit Day, suddenly the drawbridge comes up. There's a barrier put around the UK, and for 1 second, 1 minute, 1 day, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 year, we don't know. Imagine everything stops. It's called hypothetical extraction. What you do is you have to compare the current structure with everything moving with a situation where everything stops. You calculate the difference between what those relationships look like. For those of you who are engineers or mathematicians, it's just a massive linear algebra problem, right? When you do that, then you can calculate the real contribution of exports. And what it allows you to do also in the Brexit case is it allows you to calculate the exposure of every locality and every industry to Brexit. In other words, how much are you going to have to restructure to cope with Brexit? Well, of course, the answer tells you, in the case of London, really not much. But let me show you firstly, the trade surplus, the trade deficit argument, it's complete nonsense. The exposure of the rest of the European Union to Brexit is just over 2.5%. The exposure of the UK economy is 12.2%. It's 4.6 times more exposed. Why? Because the European market has a huge influence on us. But our influence on the European market, well, it's there, but it's not massive because relative size matters. Yeah.
But the number of GDP must be very comparable.
Sorry?
The amount of GDP will be comparable.
So, these are the maps, region by region, broken down.
I just put a number. 2.64 of EU GDP.
Yes.
Would be equal to 12.6.
Yeah, similar in total, that's right, yes, absolutely.
Yes, more or less same. So damage is the same.
But relative to the size of the economy.
Damage is the same.
The absolute is very similar, that's correct. But relative to the size of the country, that's the point.
Absolutely, it has to be the same.
Absolutely, it's very.
Absolutely.
That's right. It's relative to the size. It's relative, and it's not exactly the same, no, because the different trade structures through third countries. It's not the same. It's similar, but not the same. It's not simply a ratio GDP size of the UK versus the rest. It's not. Okay, that's the level. The UK is 4.6 times more dependent on or exposed to Brexit than the European Union as a whole. So the relative shock effect potentially on the UK versus the EU as a whole is much lower. Is much greater in the UK and much lower in the rest of Europe. But then what we also can do is break it down by all the countries and all the regions within Europe. What do we see? Well, the UK regions will have exposure levels of between 10% and 17% of GDP. Yep. The Irish region's exposure levels are about 10%, which is the least exposed parts of the UK, which are London and Scotland. The next most exposed parts are the German regions, particularly the southern and the western German regions, because they're very integrated with the UK in terms of supply chains, automotive, pharmaceuticals, and so on. And then the Dutch regions and the Belgian regions. So if we take the UK out, because they're just orders of magnitude higher, then what we see, the most exposed parts, the German regions are typically 5-6%. The southern and the western German regions, and you get more or less similar patterns in terms of local labour income. So you should see these numbers. The UK is 10 to 17%, the Irish region is about 10%, the German region is 4.5 to 6.5%. So the most exposed would be places like Stuttgart because of all the auto suppliers. The Dutch regions are 3.5 to 5%, the Belgian regions are all around 3 to 4%, slightly less. The French regions are around 2% typically, and the rest, 2/3 of the member states of Europe have exposure levels of less than 1%. They're not exposed at all. You think about it in terms of voting in the council, that's an important number. Poland might be exposed in terms of expatriates living in the UK, but in terms of trade relationships, there's basically nothing. And the final point in 30 seconds, another element of this which is very important, manufacturing has very, very high levels of exposure. UK manufacturing because of these trade relationships. Services, it's very low levels, but of course 78% of our economy is services. So in absolute terms, what you actually see, in absolute terms, UK service industries are the most exposed in terms of the total number of jobs, and we can break it down by activities and sectors, and also we can do it by occupations. What do we see? The most exposed in aggregate are high productivity jobs in service industries, legal, accounting, computing, technical engineering, jobs that have no political lobbying, no national coverage, no basically national vision. Here's the financial services down here. It's actually very small relatively. It's big in absolute terms, but it's just relative. What we calculate, there's over between 2 and 2.5 million jobs are directly exposed to Brexit. And we also find, broken down according to types of jobs, occupational classifications, again, it's the most highly skilled, highly productive jobs which are exposed. So if you think in terms of the productivity challenges the UK faces, then this is a big problem. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think that was